It was late September, just when the weather started turning cold, but not quite cold enough to keep people from the woods. I had always liked solo camping, ever since I was young. There was something about being alone in the wilderness that made me feel clear-headed. I never had a problem with it before. No bad encounters, no close calls. Just me, my tent, my gear, and the quiet hum of nature. That changed on my last trip. I had planned for a 4-day camping trip in a national forest about a 4-hour drive from home. It wasn't a tourist-heavy place. One of those forests where you might see a handful of hikers during the day, but at night you're truly alone. I liked that. I wanted that. I wanted to be away from everything. I parked my truck at the trailhead, loaded up my pack, and started walking. I had a spot in mind about 8 miles in near a stream. It was off-trail, which meant more privacy. I had found it on an old map a few years back and had been there twice before. Nobody went that deep into the woods unless they had a reason to. Most casual hikers stayed near the designated trails, and hunters preferred areas with easier access. By the time I reached my spot, the sun was getting low. I set up camp quickly, tent, firewood, a quick check of the area. It was exactly how I remembered. The stream ran about 30 yards from my tent, clear and cold. There were no signs of recent campers, no fire pits or footprints. I was alone. The first night was quiet. The air was crisp, and the only sounds were the rustling leaves and distant calls of animals. I had a small fire going, cooked some food, and went to bed early. No problems. The second day was when things started feeling off. I spent most of the morning hiking, exploring the area, gathering some extra firewood. Around midday, I got the strange feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't a sound or a sight, just that unmistakable sensation of not being alone. I stopped, looked around. Nothing. The trees were still. The forest was quiet. Too quiet. I listened for birds, squirrels, anything. Nothing. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I had spent too much time in the silence. But I couldn't shake it. I packed up and headed back to camp, keeping my head on a swivel the whole way. That night, I built a larger fire than usual. I told myself it was for warmth, but deep down, I wanted the extra light. I ate dinner, kept my knife close, and stayed up later than I normally would. Then I heard it, a branch snapping. Not the small kind that animals break, but the kind that happens when something heavy steps on it. Came from behind my tent, deep in the trees. My first thought was a deer, but deer don't usually walk toward fire and human scent. They move away. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly turned in the direction of the noise. The trees were thick, my beam barely reaching beyond the first few rows of trunks. I scanned left, then right. Nothing. I stayed up most of the night listening. Every so often, I would hear something, a rustle, a step. It was never close, never direct. Just there. By morning, I was exhausted. I had planned for 4 days, but I told myself I'd cut it down to 3. I wasn't scared, I told myself. Just cautious. It was probably just an animal. Maybe another camper passing through. Maybe I was just tired. I spent most of the 3rd day close to camp. I didn't feel like wandering too far. Every so often, I would stop what I was doing and listen. Then I saw it. About 50 yards from my campsite, just beyond the tree line. A figure. It was a man. He was standing partially behind a tree, just barely visible. He wasn't moving, just watching. My stomach dropped. I stood there, frozen. My brain tried to make sense of it. Was he lost? A hunter? Another camper? I raised my hand, half a wave, half a signal. He didn't respond. I took a step forward. He stepped back, disappearing behind the tree. I waited, listened. Nothing. I didn't chase after him. I didn't call out. Something in my gut told me not to. Instead, I backed up toward my camp, keeping my eyes on the trees. My hands were shaking, but I forced myself to stay calm. I packed up my gear, fast. I didn't even bother eating. I threw everything into my pack, stomped out my fire, and started walking. I had an 8-mile hike back to my truck. My pace was quick, steady. I kept looking over my shoulder, listening for footsteps. The woods felt different now, less like a place of peace, more like a trap. About a mile in, I heard movement behind me. I stopped. Silence. I started walking again. A few minutes later, more movement. Closer. I turned quickly, scanning the trees. Nothing. I kept going, forcing myself not to run. Running would only make me tired, make me vulnerable. 3 miles left. The sun was starting to set. I cursed myself for not leaving earlier. Then I saw him again. He was farther up the trail, maybe 30 yards ahead. Standing there, not hiding this time. I stopped, my breath caught in my throat. He was dressed in dark clothing, his face shadowed by the trees. I gripped my knife. He didn't move. I took a slow step back. He stepped forward. I turned and ran. I ran harder than I ever had in my life. My pack slammed against my back. My legs burned. My lungs screamed. I didn't care. The forest blurred past me. I kept expecting to hear him behind me, to feel hands grabbing at me. But there was nothing. When I finally saw my truck, I nearly collapsed. I scrambled for my keys, hands shaking so badly I could barely unlock the door. I threw my pack inside, jumped in, and locked the doors. For a few minutes, I just sat there, catching my breath, staring at the trailhead. Nothing. No movement. No sound. I started the engine and floored it, gravel kicking up behind me. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on the highway. Even then, I kept checking my mirrors. I haven't been back to that forest since. I still go camping, but never alone. Never that deep. And I always trust my gut. Because sometimes the feeling of being watched isn't just a feeling. Sometimes it's real. The last time I went winter camping, I told myself I'd never do it again. But then you forget the worst parts over time, like how cold it really is, how dark the woods get, how something as small as a broken stove can turn into a real problem. You remember the good things, the stillness, the beauty of snow-covered trees, the way the air feels clean in your lungs. You forget what it feels like to wake up and not be able to feel your feet. I should have stuck to my promise. It was mid-January, deep in the northern part of Minnesota, where the forests stretch for miles and the lakes freeze over thick enough to drive on. I had done trips like this before, always alone. I liked the challenge. It was a test against the elements, a way to see how well I could prepare, how smart I could be about my supplies. The plan was simple. 3 days. Hike into the woods, set up near a frozen lake, camp in a four-season tent, and then hike back. I had enough food, fuel, and gear to last longer than that if needed. I checked the forecast, cold, but nothing unexpected. The temperature was supposed to stay between 5 and 15 degrees, which wasn't bad for winter camping if you knew what you were doing. I started my hike late in the morning, the sun already struggling to cut through the thick clouds. Snow crunched under my boots, the only sound besides my steady breathing. I had my pack strapped tight, a sled behind me with extra gear. It was hard work, dragging it through the snow, but I made good time. By late afternoon, I reached the spot I had marked on my map, a small clearing near a frozen lake, far from any roads or trails. I liked it that way. No people, no noise, just the trees and the cold. I set up my tent quickly before the sun dropped, my fingers already stiff from the temperature. I had a four-season tent, insulated pads, and a winter-rated sleeping bag. I built a small fire, enough to melt snow for water and warm my hands. The first night was quiet. I woke up once or twice, shifting in my sleeping bag, but nothing unusual. The only sound was the wind brushing against the tent, a soft rustling in the trees. The second day, I woke up to light snow falling. It was colder than expected, probably close to 0, but I layered up and got moving. I spent the day exploring the area, checking the ice on the lake. It was thick, no risk of falling through. That night, the wind picked up. I could hear it moving through the trees, stronger than before. I made sure everything was secured, double-checking the stakes on my tent. Then I crawled into my sleeping bag, exhausted. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. First, I didn't know why. Then I realized I couldn't hear the wind anymore. The forest was silent. too silent. When you camp enough, you get used to natural sounds. Even in winter, the woods aren't completely quiet. There's always something. The creak of trees, the distant crack of ice shifting, the sound of snow falling from branches. But now there was nothing. I stayed still, listening. My breath felt too loud. Then I heard it. A single, heavy crunch in the snow. It wasn't close, maybe 50 feet from my tent. But it wasn't an animal. It was too deliberate, too heavy. I lay there, staring at the ceiling of my tent, every muscle in my body tight. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Another crunch, closer this time. I reached slowly for my knife, gripping the handle tight. My heart was hammering in my chest. Another step, and then nothing. I waited. 5 minutes, 10. The silence stretched, pressing in from all sides. I didn't sleep after that. I stayed awake until the first light of morning crept through the tent walls. When I finally unzipped the door and stepped outside, the air was sharp against my face. I looked around. Nothing at first. Just fresh snow, undisturbed except for my own footprints. Then I saw them. Footprints. Big ones. They came from the trees, stopped about 30 feet from my tent, then turned back. I crouched down, staring at them. They weren't boot prints. They weren't snowshoes. They were too wide, too deep. Bare feet in the snow. I felt my stomach twist. No one could be out here like that. Not in these temperatures. Not without gear. I followed the tracks with my eyes. They led back into the trees, disappearing into the deeper snow. I couldn't see where they ended. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe just the way the snow settled. Maybe an animal. But I packed up that day. I told myself I was cutting the trip short because the temperature was dropping, that it wasn't worth staying another night. But the truth was, I didn't want to find out who or what had been standing outside my tent in the middle of the night. I hiked out fast, barely stopping for breaks. The whole time I felt something behind me, not close, not visible, but there, watching. I reached my truck just before sunset, my breath fogging in the freezing air. When I turned the key, the engine struggled for a second before roaring to life. I sat there, hands on the wheel, staring into the darkening woods. Then I put it in gear and left. I've camped a lot of places. I've dealt with cold, hunger, injuries. But that trip was different. I still don't know what was out there watching me that night. And I don't want to. I haven't gone winter camping since. I don't know what I was thinking when I decided to camp in the old graveyard. Maybe I was trying to prove something to myself, or maybe I just wanted to do something different. It wasn't supposed to be a big deal, just one night. I camped in worse places before. The graveyard wasn't famous or well known. It was just a small, overgrown patch of land outside a quiet town. No big stories, no legends, no ghost tales. Just a forgotten place where people had been buried a long time ago. It had been abandoned for years. The headstones were cracked, the grass was wild, and the dirt paths had faded into nothing. People had stopped coming here. Even the families of the dead had moved on. It wasn't hard to get there. A short drive down an empty road, a hike through a patch of woods, and then there it was. A quiet, empty graveyard with no visitors, no fresh flowers, no signs of life. The place felt forgotten, like time had erased it. The iron gate at the entrance was rusted, hanging off its hinges. The stone walls around the perimeter had crumbled in places, letting trees and vines creep in. It was clear that no one had cared for this place in years. I set up my tent near the edge, close to a few tombstones that had been swallowed by weeds. I wasn't scared. The place felt eerie, but I'd been in the woods alone plenty of times before. The wind moved through the trees, rustling the leaves, but other than that, it was silent. No distant traffic, no voices, nothing. Just the sound of the breeze and the occasional creak of tree branches. I laid out my sleeping bag and lit a small fire with some dry wood I'd brought with me. The flames flickered, casting shadows across the graves. The names on the stones were barely readable. Time had worn them down to just faint letters and numbers. Some graves were nothing but lumps in the earth now, the markers missing or broken. As the night settled in, the temperature dropped. The air was damp, and every breath came out as a mist. The fire crackled, sending up little sparks, but beyond its light, the darkness felt heavy. I listened for sounds. Animals, the wind, anything, but the silence felt too thick. Something about it started to bother me. I was used to nature having a rhythm. Owls hooting, insects chirping, leaves rustling. But this place was still, too still. Then I heard something, a shift in the grass, a soft, slow movement, not the wind, something moving. I turned, looking past the fire's glow, but I didn't see anything, just the uneven ground and the dark shapes of headstones. I told myself it was just an animal, fox maybe, a raccoon, nothing to worry about. I went back to the fire, but the feeling stuck with me. The next time I heard it, it was closer. A step, a single footstep on the dry leaves. I stood up slowly. The firelight only reached so far, and beyond it was just blackness. I listened, waiting, barely breathing. Nothing. I stayed like that for a while, staring into the dark. Then, I sat back down, telling myself I was being paranoid. And then I heard it again. This time, behind me. I spun around so fast that I knocked over my water bottle. My heart was pounding. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on, sweeping it over the area. The beam of light passed over crooked tombstones, dry grass, and open space. Nothing, but something had been there. I knew it. I stayed awake after that, listening. The fire burned lower, casting smaller shadows, but I didn't dare put it out. I kept my flashlight in my hand, sweeping it across the graveyard every few minutes. Then I saw something. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light. A shape low to the ground, near one of the older graves. It looked like a pile of leaves at first, but then it moved. Slow, deliberate, like someone crawling. My breath caught in my throat. I clicked off my flashlight, hoping that if I couldn't see it, it couldn't see me. The fire was low, barely flickering now, and I felt completely exposed. I forced myself to listen. The sound of something dragging, the crunch of dead leaves. It was moving closer. I grabbed my knife, gripping it tight, even though I wasn't sure what I was planning to do. I didn't move, didn't make a sound, just waited. The dragging stopped. Then came the breathing. It was close, just past the edge of the firelight. Deep, slow breaths, like someone trying to stay quiet. I wanted to run, but I knew better. I camped in the wild before. I knew that sometimes staying still was the only thing that kept you safe. I held my breath. Minutes passed. The breathing stopped. I waited. Then, finally, I heard movement again, this time going the other way. A slow retreat, the sound fading into the distance. I stayed awake the whole night, gripping my knife, staring into the darkness. I didn't hear anything else after that. No more footsteps, no more breathing. But I didn't sleep. When the sun finally came up, I packed my things as fast as I could. I didn't bother with breakfast. I just wanted to get out of there. As I rolled up my sleeping bag, I noticed something. Footprints. Not mine. They circled my camp. Slow, deliberate steps. A pattern like someone had been walking around me in the dark. I didn't wait to think about it. I grabbed my gear, threw dirt over the fire, and left. I didn't look back. I don't know who or what was out there that night, but I do know one thing. I will never camp in a graveyard again. I don't camp much anymore. When I was younger, I used to go out into the woods all the time, setting up camp in the quiet places where nobody else would go. It was peaceful, just the sound of the wind through the trees, the crackling of the fire, the occasional rustling in the underbrush. I never thought much about those noises before. Animals, mostly. But after that night, I learned to pay more attention. To listen. To really listen. I was 29 when it happened. This was back in 2011, late October. The weather was getting cold, but not unbearable. It was the kind of crisp air that made your breath fog up in the morning but felt good in your lungs. I had a long weekend off from work, so I decided to head out alone. Just me, my gear, and miles of untouched land. I picked a spot I'd camped at before, deep in the Appalachian foothills of Kentucky. It was about a 2-hour hike from the nearest dirt road, and I'd never seen another soul out there. Perfect. I wanted silence. I wanted to be away from everything. The first day went fine. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and cooked a simple meal. As the sun went down, I sat by the fire, watching the flames dance and listening to the wind. That first night, I slept like a rock. The second night was different. It started with the woods going silent. If you've spent enough time outdoors, you know what I mean. The natural sounds, crickets, owls, even the wind just stop. It's like something presses a mute button on the entire forest. That happened around dusk, just as I was finishing up my food. I felt it before I heard anything. The sensation of being watched. My skin prickled, and the back of my neck went tight. I looked around, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. The fire crackled in front of me, and my tent was zipped up behind me. Everything looked normal, but it didn't feel normal. Then I heard footsteps. Not a deer, not a bear. Something walking deliberately just outside the glow of the fire. Slow, careful steps. Too heavy for a raccoon, too light for something large. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the trees. Nothing. The sound stopped the moment I shined the light. I stood up, listening. The silence stretched out, thick and unnatural. I told myself it was an animal and sat back down. But I didn't feel right. It wasn't long before the sound came back. This time it was closer. Still deliberate, still careful. It was circling me. I felt my stomach tighten, my heartbeat hammering in my chest. I grabbed my knife, not that it would do much good against whatever was out there. I waited, barely breathing. Then, a sound I will never forget. My own voice came from the trees, just beyond the firelight. My own voice, calling out, low and stretched, like someone was trying to mimic me but didn't quite know how. It made my blood go cold. The fire crackled, and I forced myself to move, scanning the darkness with my flashlight. My hands were shaking. I tried to tell myself I was imagining it, that I was just hearing things. But deep down, I knew better. I stayed awake that night, gripping my knife, staring into the woods. The footsteps came and went, sometimes close, sometimes far, but they never fully left. And every now and then, I'd hear that awful, stretched-out version of my voice. I should have left at first light. I don't know why I didn't. I guess I didn't want to believe what was happening. I packed up my camp slowly, my body stiff from a night without sleep. I kept my knife in my pocket and my flashlight in my hand. Even though the sun was up, I forced myself to eat something before the hike back, even though my stomach was tied in knots. That was when I noticed something was wrong with my gear. My backpack had been moved. Not much, just a few inches, but I knew exactly where I had left it the night before. The straps were undone like someone had gone through it. My water bottle was missing. That was the last straw. I threw everything together and started hiking back, moving fast but trying not to run. The whole way I felt it behind me, not right behind me, not close enough to see, but there, stalking me, following me. Then, maybe half a mile from my truck, I heard it again, my voice calling my name. But this time, it wasn't coming from behind me. It was ahead of me. I stopped dead in my tracks. The woods were silent again. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I felt my heartbeat in my throat. And then I saw it. A figure stepped out from behind a tree maybe 50 feet away. First, I thought it was a man, but it wasn't. It was wrong. It was tall, too tall, and thin in a way that didn't look natural. Its arms were long, its fingers too stretched, too sharp. And its face, it looked like me, but not me. Like something had tried to copy my face and had gotten close but not close enough. The eyes were wrong, too wide, too empty. The mouth was stretched too far, lips thin, curled like they didn't know how to sit naturally. And then it moved, not like a person, not like anything I've ever seen. It took a step toward me, slow and jerky, its head tilting to the side, the mouth twisting. And then it grinned. I ran. I ran harder than I ever have in my life, lungs burning, legs screaming. I could hear it behind me, not running, just walking. Fast, but not running. Like it knew I couldn't get away. The truck came into view and I didn't slow down. I fumbled with my keys, hands shaking so bad I could barely get the door open. I slammed myself inside, locked the doors, and started the engine. I didn't look back. I floored it, gravel kicking up behind me as I tore down the dirt road. I didn't stop driving for hours. When I finally did, I sat there in silence, my hands still shaking on the wheel. My face was pale in the rearview mirror, my eyes hollow. I haven't been camping since. I still think about that thing, about the way it moved, the way it looked, the way it called my name in my own voice. I don't go into the woods alone anymore. I don't think I ever will again. I was never the kind of guy to get scared easily. I grew up in Texas, spent my childhood hunting, fishing, and camping with my dad. The woods were like a second home to me, and I never felt out of place in them. But after what happened on a solo camping trip in northern Montana in the summer of 2013, I don't think I'll ever look at the wilderness the same way again. It started as a simple plan. I had just turned 32 and had a week off work. I figured I'd head up to a secluded campsite along the Missouri River, a spot I had visited once before with an old friend years ago. The place was remote, about a 2-hour drive from the nearest small town and then another few miles of rough dirt trails leading to a clearing by the water. There was no cell service, no rangers nearby, just miles of deep forest and the slow-moving river cutting through it. I had my gear packed, my old tent, sleeping bag, a .45 in my pack just in case of wildlife, and enough food and water to last me for a few days. I also brought my fishing rod, hoping to catch some fresh trout for dinner. It was supposed to be a peaceful, quiet trip, just me and nature, but things don't always go as planned. The drive up was uneventful. The dirt road was rougher than I remembered, with deep ruts from spring rains, but my truck handled it fine. When I finally pulled up to the clearing by the river, the spot was just as beautiful as I had remembered. Tall pines lining the shore, the water calm and deep, the air crisp and fresh. I set up my tent a little way from the water, close enough to hear the gentle flow but far enough back to stay dry. There were no other campers around, which was exactly what I wanted. That first day went by without a hitch. I fished for a while, caught a couple of decent-sized trout, cooked them over my small fire, and ate while watching the sun set over the trees. As the sky darkened, I threw a few more logs on the fire and leaned back against a fallen log, listening to the sounds of the forest. Crickets, the occasional owl, the distant rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Normal sounds, nothing out of place. But around midnight, I started feeling uneasy. It wasn't any specific noise that tipped me off, just a strange, creeping feeling that I was being watched. The fire had burned low by then, casting long shadows into the trees. I sat up, scanned the darkness, and listened. Nothing, just the river and the night sounds. I told myself I was just spooking myself for no reason, but I still grabbed my flashlight and did a slow scan of the trees. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, maybe a weirdly shaped tree or a shadow moving in the breeze. But the longer I stared, the more certain I became. About 50 yards into the woods, just beyond the reach of my flashlight, there was something standing there. Not an animal, not a tree, something tall, human-shaped, standing perfectly still between the trunks. I felt my stomach tighten. I pointed my flashlight directly at it, but the beam only reached so far, and the thing, whatever it was, didn't move. It didn't make a sound. I didn't move either. I just sat there, my breath coming slow and quiet, my heart hammering against my ribs. After what felt like minutes, I blinked, and the shape was gone. I don't remember going into my tent that night, but I must have, because I woke up inside it the next morning. The fire was out, the air was cold, and everything seemed normal, almost like I had imagined the whole thing. By the time the sun was up, I had convinced myself I had just been seeing things in the dark. Maybe a dead tree at an odd angle, maybe my mind playing tricks on me. I spent the morning fishing again, made some coffee, and shook off the weird feeling from the night before. I even laughed at myself a little, but then I noticed something strange. My cooler, which I had left near the fire pit, was open. I was sure I had latched it the night before, but now the lid was wide open, and 2 of my food containers were missing. No signs of an animal tearing through it, just gone. Neatly taken. My knife, which I had left next to my plate the night before, was also missing. A shiver ran down my spine. I started looking around the clearing more carefully. That's when I saw the footprints. They weren't mine. The tracks were clear in the damp soil near my tent. They were human, barefoot, long, narrow, and deep enough to show that whoever had made them was heavy. They led from the tree line to my campfire to my cooler, then back into the woods. I felt my throat tighten. My brain started running through possibilities. A lost hiker? A local messing with me? Some drifter hiding out in the woods? Whoever it was, they had been close. Real close. I packed up my gear within minutes. Every instinct in me screamed to get the hell out of there. But something about just running felt wrong. If someone was out there watching, they would know I was scared. And scared people make easy targets. So I forced myself to stay calm. I cleaned up my sight, packed everything into my truck, and left it looking like I wasn't planning on leaving yet. Then I took my rifle from the back seat and slung it over my shoulder. I decided to check the tree line. I followed the footprints about 20 yards into the trees before they faded into the underbrush. But as I stood there, scanning the ground, I noticed something else. A faint trail leading deeper into the woods. A narrow, overgrown path, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. And something told me I needed to see where it went. I walked slowly, rifle in hand, stepping as quietly as I could. The trees grew denser, the light dimming as the canopy thickened overhead. I moved another 50 yards before I saw it. A small, makeshift shelter, barely more than a pile of branches and a tattered old tarp. And beside it, a pile of trash. Empty cans, torn clothing, and a plastic container that looked exactly like the ones missing from my cooler. Someone had been living out here, but the worst part wasn't the shelter. It was what was next to it. A pair of boots, and a hunting knife. My knife. I didn't stay to look any longer. I turned and walked, fast, but controlled, back toward my truck. The whole time, I felt like I was being watched, but I didn't stop. By the time I reached the clearing, my hands were shaking. I threw my gear into the truck, started the engine, and got the hell out of there. I didn't stop driving until I hit the main road. I never reported it. I figured there wasn't much to report. No crime had been committed, technically. Just someone living off-grid, too close to my camp for comfort. But the thought that stuck with me was this. Whoever it was, they had been there while I slept. Watching, close enough to take my knife, close enough to steal from my cooler. And I never even heard them. I still camp, but never alone. Never in places that isolated. And I always keep my rifle within reach. I had been driving for hours, the steady hum of the engine blending with the rhythmic patter of rain against the windshield. The sky had been overcast all day, and by the time I turned onto the narrow dirt road leading into the forest, dusk was already settling in. I had planned this camping trip for weeks. Just me, the woods, and a night away from everything. I like solitude. I had spent most of my life seeking out places where I wouldn't hear another voice, where the only sounds were the wind through the trees and the occasional rustling of unseen creatures. This was one of those places, a remote patch of forest I had found on an old hiking map. There were no marked campsites, no ranger stations, just a forgotten dirt road that wound through miles of dense forest. By the time I found a clearing that looked suitable, the rain had picked up, tapping against the roof of my truck in steady bursts. I killed the engine, stepping out into the cool, damp air. The forest smelled of wet earth and pine, the scent thick in the humid air. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, grabbing my gear from the back of the truck. The ground was soft from the rain, but not muddy yet. I picked a spot a little ways from the road, where the trees were thinner and the ground looked dry enough for a tent. It took me longer than usual to set up. The rain made everything slick, and by the time I got the stakes driven into the earth, my fingers were numb from the cold. I sat in my small fold-out chair under the cover of a tarp, listening to the rain. My flashlight cast a weak glow on the damp grass, barely cutting through the darkness beyond. I hadn't seen another person for miles, and that was exactly how I liked it. The night settled in thick and heavy. The only sounds were the steady drip of rain from the trees and the occasional creak of the branches as the wind pushed through them. The fire I had tried to build was a failure, the wood too damp to catch. I resigned myself to a cold dinner, eating from a can while the darkness pressed in around me. I wasn't afraid of the woods. I had been camping alone since I was a teenager, and I knew how to handle myself. But something about that night felt off. It wasn't anything obvious, just a feeling, a weight in the air that made my skin prickle. I brushed it off. The mind plays tricks when you're alone in the dark. I sat for a long time, watching the rain bead against my tarp, letting the steady sound lull me into a daze. Eventually, exhaustion won over, and I crawled into my tent, zipping the flap shut against the damp air. I don't know how long I slept before I woke up. It wasn't a sound that woke me, more of a shift in the atmosphere. The rain had slowed to a light drizzle, and the forest was eerily silent. No wind, no rustling leaves, just stillness. I listened, my body tense. My tent was small, barely enough room to sit up, but I felt exposed, vulnerable. Then I heard it, a soft, deliberate sound. Footsteps, not the heavy, clumsy steps of an animal, but careful, measured steps. I froze, barely breathing. The sound was close, moving slowly around my campsite. I reached for my flashlight, gripping it tight. The tent fabric was thin. If someone wanted to get inside, it wouldn't take much. The footsteps circled once, then stopped. Silence. I waited, every nerve in my body on edge. Then the sound started again, moving away this time, fading into the forest. I lay there for a long time, every muscle in my body tight. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted into a light, restless sleep. Morning came gray and cold, the rain still falling in a soft mist. I stepped out of my tent, stretching the stiffness from my limbs. The forest looked the same as it had the night before, silent, damp, empty. But I wasn't imagining things. There were footprints. They weren't mine. They circled my tent in a slow, deliberate path, then trailed off into the woods. I stood there for a long time, staring at them. The prints weren't fresh. The rain had softened their edges, but they were there. Someone had been here. I packed up quickly, shoving my gear into my truck without care. I had planned to stay another night, but I wasn't going to risk it. As I drove back down the dirt road, I kept glancing in the mirror, half expecting to see something step out from the trees. But there was nothing, just the empty, wet forest stretching for miles. I didn't go camping alone again after that. I had been on the road for weeks, moving through France at my own pace, setting up camp wherever I found a good spot. It was the kind of trip I had always wanted to take. Just me, my gear, and the quiet of nature. I wasn't the type to stay in crowded campgrounds. I preferred the more secluded places, deep in the woods, where I wouldn't have to hear people talking or cars passing. This was sometime in the early 2000s. I was in my late 20s, still young enough to think I was invincible, but old enough to have some caution. I had driven my old van through the countryside, past small towns, stopping at random when I saw a place that looked good for the night. That day, I had been driving through a quiet stretch of road that cut through a forest. It was somewhere near the Dordogne region, not too far from a village, but far enough that I knew I wouldn't be disturbed. The forest was dense, the trees tall and packed together in a way that made the place feel untouched. There was a small dirt path leading off the road, barely visible, like it hadn't been used in years. That was exactly the kind of place I was looking for. I turned onto it and drove in until the trees closed around me, making the van feel like it was swallowed by the forest. It was late afternoon when I set up camp. The spot was perfect, silent except for the occasional sound of birds, the wind rustling through the trees. I set up my tent a little ways from the van, laid out my gear, and started a small fire. I sat there for a while, just enjoying the quiet, eating a simple meal, watching the last light of the sun disappear behind the trees. The forest took on a different feeling at night. I had camped alone enough times to know that the dark could play tricks on you. Every little sound seemed louder, closer, but I had always been able to brush it off. That night was different. It started with a sound, something moving through the trees. Slow, deliberate, not an animal. Animals move fast, unpredictable. This was steady, careful. I turned my head, trying to see through the darkness. My fire was small, not enough to push back the shadows beyond a few feet. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it toward the sound. The trees stood still. Nothing moved. I told myself it was probably a deer, maybe a fox, something harmless. But then I heard it again, closer this time. I stood up, scanning the trees with my flashlight. I still couldn't see anything, but I felt it, that unmistakable feeling of being watched. I wasn't the kind of person to spook easily. I had camped alone plenty of times. I knew what the woods sounded like, but this felt wrong. Then I saw her. She was standing just at the edge of the trees, barely visible in the weak light. A woman. She was thin, too thin, her skin pale like she hadn't seen sunlight in years. Her hair hung in messy strands around her face. She was wearing something dark, tattered. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, staring at me. I don't know how long we stood like that, but I felt frozen, like moving would break some kind of rule I didn't understand. Finally, I managed to find my voice. I called out, not a greeting, not a question, just noise. Something to break the silence. She didn't react, didn't blink, just stood there staring. A chill ran down my spine. I had met weird people before while camping, but this was different. There was something off about her, something unnatural, not in a supernatural way, but in the way some people just feel wrong, like they don't fit into the world the way everyone else does. I didn't want to turn my back on her, but I also wasn't going to stand there all night staring at this woman. I took a step back toward my tent, keeping the flashlight on her. That's when she moved. Not toward me, not away. She just shifted, her body swaying slightly like she was trying to decide something. Then she tilted her head, slow, unnatural. That was enough for me. I grabbed my knife from my gear and held it where she could see. I wasn't looking for trouble, but I needed her to know I wasn't defenseless. She still didn't react. I made my way to the van, my heart pounding, never taking my eyes off her. When I reached it, I yanked the door open, climbed inside, and locked it. For a while, I just sat there, gripping my knife, watching. She didn't move. Minutes passed, then an hour. She stood in the same spot the whole time, barely shifting. Then, just as I was starting to wonder if she'd stand there all night, she turned. No rush, no sound. Just turned and walked slowly back into the trees, disappearing into the darkness. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the knife in my lap, my eyes on the tree line, waiting for her to come back. She didn't. By morning, the woods looked normal again. Birds were chirping. The sun was filtering through the trees like nothing had happened. But I didn't waste time packing up. I threw my gear into the van, started the engine, and drove out of there as fast as I could. I told myself she was just some lost hiker, maybe someone living in the woods. But I knew, deep down, that wasn't it. There was something wrong with her, something I still can't explain. I never camped in that part of France again. I still think about her sometimes, especially when I'm alone in the woods. I wonder how many other people have seen her, and I wonder if next time she won't just stand there watching. I don't know if it was just bad luck or poor judgment that got me into trouble that summer. It was 2018, and I had planned a solo camping trip through France, something I'd been wanting to do for years. I was 28, in decent shape, and confident in my ability to handle myself outdoors. I had camped plenty of times before, though mostly in designated spots, nothing too remote. But this time, I wanted something different. I wanted to get away from the crowded sites filled with families and retirees in camper vans. I had a route planned, starting from the northeast and working my way down. But I never made it past the first stop. I had set my sights on a small camping area in the Auvergne region. It was tucked away in the forests near a lake, not too far from a village. The place had good reviews online. Quiet, scenic, and peaceful. Exactly what I was looking for. The drive was straightforward until I reached the last stretch. A sign pointed left for the official campsite, but my GPS kept telling me to take a narrow dirt road off to the right. I hesitated. It looked more like a maintenance path than a road, but I figured maybe it was a back entrance or a shortcut. I followed it, expecting it to merge with the main road again. Didn't. The further I went, the rougher it got. The trees pressed in from both sides, their branches scraping against my car. The road was full of potholes, and after about 15 minutes of driving at a crawl, I realized I had made a mistake. There was no way this led to the campsite. I decided to turn back, but that's when I saw a clearing up ahead. A wide, open space surrounded by dense forest with a fire pit in the middle. It looked like an unofficial camping spot. It wasn't what I had planned, but by then, I was tired. The sun was already low in the sky, and I didn't want to risk damaging my car on the way out. I could just camp here for the night and find my way back in the morning. The place was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no insects, just the rustling of leaves. The air felt heavy, like it does before a storm, though the sky was clear. I set up my tent quickly, trying to shake the strange feeling creeping over me. I built a small fire and ate a quick meal. As the light faded, I realized something else. There was no sign that anyone had used this spot recently. The fire pit was cold, no trash, no tire tracks. Just an empty, forgotten space in the woods. I told myself that was a good thing. No other campers meant no noisy neighbors, but the silence was unsettling. I forced myself to relax, stretching out in my sleeping bag, listening to the crackle of the fire outside. I told myself I was overthinking it. I was alone. There was nothing to be afraid of. Then, just as I started to drift off, I heard it. A sound, faint but clear. Twigs snapping. Something moving just beyond the firelight. I held my breath, listening. The fire was burning low now, casting flickering shadows on the trees. I waited, my heart pounding. Could have been an animal, a deer maybe, but something felt off. The sound stopped. Silence. I exhaled slowly, trying to stay calm. Maybe it was just my imagination. I was in an unfamiliar place, alone in the dark. My mind was playing tricks on me. I turned onto my side, pulling my sleeping bag up, and closed my eyes again. More snapping. Closer this time. My eyes shot open. I sat up, my pulse hammering in my ears. I reached for my flashlight and aimed it toward the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on trees, bushes, empty space. Nothing, but I knew something was there. I waited, scanning the trees, but whatever it was had gone still. I told myself to stay rational. Could have been a fox or a boar. Wild animals weren't uncommon. I wasn't in any danger. As long as I kept my food sealed, they wouldn't bother me. But I wasn't convinced. I let the fire burn a little longer before finally forcing myself to lie back down. I kept my knife close and my flashlight within reach. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep. A noise pulled me from my dreams. Soft, slow, footsteps on dirt. I froze, my pulse hammering. They weren't coming from the trees. They were inside my campsite. I lay completely still, barely breathing. The fire had burned down to embers, and my tent was zipped shut. I was blind to whatever was outside. The footsteps moved closer. Whoever it was, they were circling my tent. I gripped my knife so tightly my hand ached. I was trapped. If I unzipped the tent, I'd be exposed. If I stayed inside, I had no idea what they might do. The footsteps stopped right next to my head. Silence. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and burnt wood. Then something brushed against the tent fabric. Not an animal. A hand. I stopped breathing. A long, slow drag of fingers across the nylon. Deliberate. Testing. I swallowed hard, trying to think. If I made a sound, would it scare them off? Or would it make things worse? I tightened my grip on the knife. If they tried to come in, I would fight. I had no other choice. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Silence. Minutes passed. I didn't move. Then, finally, footsteps. Retreating. Fading into the trees. I stayed awake the rest of the night, knife in hand, waiting for them to come back. They didn't. At the first light of dawn, I crawled out of the tent, my whole body stiff with fear. The fire pit was nothing but ashes now, and the air was thick with the scent of morning dew. I looked around, searching for footprints. The ground was disturbed, but not enough to give me a clear idea of what or who had been there. I packed up as fast as I could, my hands shaking. The drive back was rough. My tires skidded on the damp earth, branches scraped against the doors, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get out. When I finally reached the main road, I pulled over, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. I forced myself to breathe, to think. Who had been out there? And more importantly, how long had they been watching me? I drove straight to the nearest town, found a cafe, and sat there for over an hour, trying to calm down. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. I never went back to that campsite. I don't even know if I could find it again. And I don't want to. It had been raining since midday. Not the light kind of rain that you could ignore, but a steady, heavy downfall that soaked through clothes, turned dirt to mud, and made everything feel colder than it really was. I was miles deep in the woods, far from the main road, alone with nothing but my tent, my gear, and the sound of rain hammering down on the trees above. I had planned this camping trip for a while. After weeks of being stuck inside, dealing with work, and barely getting any fresh air, I just wanted to get out into the wild, away from everything. The forecast had called for some rain, but I hadn't expected it to last this long or come down this hard. I had set up camp earlier in the afternoon when the rain had just started, picking a relatively dry patch of ground between two large trees. My tent was small but sturdy, my sleeping bag thick enough to keep the cold away, and my gear was packed in waterproof bags. By the time night started creeping in, the temperature had dropped. The rain had soaked the forest floor, and a thin mist had started forming between the trees. I sat in my tent with my small lantern on, eating a cold meal out of a can, listening to the rain. It was peaceful at first, just the rhythmic sound of water hitting the tent, the distant creaks of tree branches, the occasional rustling in the undergrowth, the kind of quiet that makes you feel completely alone. But then, something changed. It was subtle at first, a shift in the atmosphere, a feeling that I wasn't as alone as I had thought. The sound of the rain had masked everything else, but as I sat there, I started noticing something different, something moving beyond the usual noises of the forest. It was faint, almost blending with the rain, but there was a pattern to it, a crunching sound, footsteps. I held my breath, listening. The rain had softened the ground, but whatever was moving out there was heavy enough to make noise. It wasn't an animal, at least not a small one. It was deliberate, slow, like someone walking carefully through the woods. I reached for my flashlight, turning off the lantern so I wouldn't be visible from the outside. The inside of the tent went dark instantly, and I felt my heartbeat in my ears. The footsteps continued, stopping and starting again, closer now. I slowly unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The rain had let up slightly, but the forest was still dark, shadows stretching between the trees. I scanned the area, moving the flashlight carefully. Nothing. No movement, no sign of anything unusual. Just trees, wet ground, and mist curling through the undergrowth. But I knew I wasn't imagining it. I sat there for what felt like an hour, my back against the tent wall, flashlight gripped in my hand. The footsteps had stopped, but that didn't mean whoever or whatever had been out there was gone. The rain picked up again, masking any other sounds, making it impossible to tell if something was moving just beyond my line of sight. Eventually, exhaustion started to take over. I lay down, fully clothed, my flashlight within reach, listening. The rain, the wind, the distant rustling. Nothing else. At some point, I must have dozed off. I woke up suddenly. Something was outside my tent. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The rain had lightened, and through the thin fabric of the tent, I could hear its slow, deliberate movement. Someone was standing just outside. I could hear the weight shift in the mud, the quiet inhale of breath. Not an animal, not the wind. Someone. I felt a wave of cold fear rush through me. I wasn't near any trails. No one else should be out here. I reached for the knife I kept with my gear, gripping it tightly. I stayed completely still, waiting, listening. The figure outside wasn't moving anymore, just standing there, watching. The seconds stretched on. And then, just as quietly as it had come, it moved away. I heard the footsteps retreat, fading into the rain. I didn't move for a long time, even after I was sure they were gone. I stayed in place, gripping the knife, listening for any hint of movement. At some point, I must have drifted in and out of sleep again because the next thing I knew, it was early morning. The rain had stopped. The forest was silent. I unzipped the tent slowly, stepping outside into the damp morning air. The ground was muddy, puddles forming in the lower areas of the clearing. And then I saw them, footprints, not just mine. They were fresh, leading from the tree line straight to my tent, stopping just outside the entrance, and then turning back. I followed them with my eyes, tracing their path back toward the woods. They disappeared into the undergrowth, vanishing into the thick trees. Whoever had been there had stood just inches from where I had been sleeping, watching, listening. I packed my gear quickly. I didn't waste time. Whatever had happened that night, I wasn't going to wait around to find out if they would come back. As I hiked back toward my truck, the feeling of being watched never left. Even as I reached the main road, even as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere in those woods, someone had been waiting, and they had chosen to walk away, this time. I had always loved camping. It was something I did whenever I needed to clear my head, whenever life felt too busy, or when I just wanted some time away from everything. Being out in the wild with nothing but the sound of wind in the trees and the distant calls of animals always gave me a sense of peace. That's why, on a cool autumn weekend, I packed my gear and drove out to a national forest a few hours from home. I had been there before, twice actually, but this time I planned to hike deeper than I ever had. I wanted real solitude, not just the kind you find near campsites where families park their RVs. I wanted the kind where no one was around for miles. I parked my truck at a dirt pull-off where a trailhead started, slung my pack over my shoulders, and headed in. The trail was narrow, winding up through dense trees, and the deeper I went, the quieter it became. That was one thing about being out in the wilderness. At a certain point, the background hum of the world disappeared. No distant cars, no voices, no hum of electricity, just nature. I hiked for nearly 5 hours before I found a spot that felt right. It was a clearing next to a small stream, surrounded by towering pines and thick brush. The ground was flat, perfect for my tent, and the stream would be a good water source. The nearest marked trail was at least 2 miles away. I was truly alone. That night, as I sat by my fire, eating a simple meal and watching the flames dance, I felt at ease. I stared up at the sky, which was clear and filled with stars, and thought about how perfect the moment was. Then I heard something. It was faint, barely noticeable over the crackling fire, but it was there. A rustling sound. Not wind through leaves, this was different. More deliberate, like footsteps. I froze, listening. The sound stopped. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer moving through the trees. Still, I felt uneasy. The forest suddenly felt too quiet, like it was holding its breath. I stood up, shining my flashlight into the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trunks and branches. I swept it back and forth, my heart beating a little faster. Nothing. Shaking my head, I sat back down. I was letting my imagination get to me. This was what I wanted, right? Solitude, complete isolation. Still, when I went to bed, I kept my knife close, just in case. The next morning, I woke early, feeling more rested than I expected. The night had passed without incident, and in the daylight, my nerves from the night before felt silly. I spent the day hiking further out, exploring areas of the forest that felt untouched. I saw animal tracks, heard the calls of birds, and even spotted a few deer in the distance. It was exactly what I had come for. When I returned to my campsite in the late afternoon, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There were footprints near my tent. Not mine. I could see my own prints in the dirt, leading to and from the trail I had taken earlier. But these were different, larger, heavier. Someone had been here. I felt a rush of adrenaline, scanning the area. My first thought was that a ranger had passed through, maybe checking to see if I had a permit. But no, it didn't make sense. I was too far from any marked trails. And why wouldn't they have announced themselves? I checked my gear. Nothing was missing. My food was untouched, my pack still zipped up. But the idea that someone had been standing here, near my tent, while I was gone, it sent a deep, instinctive fear through me. I considered leaving, packing up and hiking back to my truck before nightfall. But I had spent so much time getting out here, and I told myself I was overreacting. Could have been a hunter passing through. Maybe they saw my tent and left without disturbing anything. So I stayed. That night, I made my fire bigger, brighter. The glow pushed back the darkness, making me feel a little safer. But as I sat there, I kept glancing at the trees, expecting to see movement. I heard nothing, saw nothing, but I knew, deep down, that I wasn't alone. I barely slept. Every sound outside my tent made my heart race. But when morning came, everything seemed normal again. The fear felt distant, irrational, until I stepped outside. The footprints were back. More of them this time, closer to my tent. And something had been left behind. A small pile of rocks, stacked neatly, right in front of my tent's entrance. I stared at it, my skin crawling. Someone had come right up to my tent while I was sleeping. Someone had stood just inches away from where I lay, completely unaware. I didn't hesitate this time. I packed up as fast as I could, stuffing everything into my backpack, not even bothering to eat breakfast. I just wanted to get out. As I started hiking back, I felt watched. Every few minutes, I glanced over my shoulder. The trees seemed denser than before, the shadows darker. I walked fast, my heart pounding. Then I saw it. A man, standing just off the trail, partially hidden by trees. He was dressed in dark clothing, his face obscured by the shadows. He didn't move, didn't call out, just stood there. I didn't stop, didn't run either. I just kept moving, forcing myself not to panic. I walked for hours, pushing myself to the limit. By the time I reached my truck, my legs were shaking. I tossed my gear in the back, jumped in, and locked the doors. As I started the engine, I looked back at the trailhead. He was there, standing at the edge of the trees, watching me. I didn't stay to get a better look. I floored it, speeding down the dirt road, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I didn't stop until I was back on the main road, miles away from that forest. I never went camping alone again. I have always liked the outdoors. Growing up, my dad used to take me camping and hunting, and it became something I kept doing well into adulthood. I liked the isolation, the quiet, and the way the air smelled in the middle of nowhere. The further away from people, the better. It was just me, the woods, and the sound of wind moving through the trees. I thought I knew what to expect when I went out there, but there was one trip that changed everything for me. It happened a few years ago, back when I was still living in Montana. I had taken a week off from work and decided to go deep into the mountains, deeper than I had ever gone before. I wanted complete solitude, No roads, no people, just me and the wild. I packed enough supplies for a full week. Food, water, my rifle, my knife, my tent, everything I would need. The hike took most of the day. I had a GPS with me, but I also trusted my map and compass more. The further I walked, the more I could feel myself sinking into that quiet, detached state I always got when I was out in nature for a while. The sun was getting lower when I finally found a good spot. High ground, flat, not too many trees blocking the view. I set up my tent, got a small fire going, and ate some jerky while listening to the sounds of the forest. Everything felt normal. The first night was fine. I woke up to the sound of something moving outside my tent, but that wasn't unusual. Could have been a deer, maybe a fox, maybe even a bear. I kept my rifle close and went back to sleep. The second day, I spent my time hiking around, gathering wood, and making sure my camp was in good shape. The whole time, I felt like I was being watched. Not in a paranoid way, not like something was directly staring at me, but just an odd sense that I wasn't as alone as I thought. I've had that feeling before. Sometimes it's just your mind playing tricks on you. I ignored it. That night, things started getting strange. I was lying in my tent, listening to the fire crackling outside, when I heard footsteps. Heavy ones, slow and deliberate, not an animal. Animals move in bursts, fast and erratic. This was something moving with purpose, like it knew exactly where it was going. I grabbed my rifle and listened. The footsteps circled my camp. I held my breath. My heart was pounding, and I could hear blood rushing in my ears. Then they stopped. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. Nothing. I slowly unzipped the tent and peered out. The fire was still going, casting flickering shadows across the trees. But there was nothing there. I stepped out with my rifle and did a slow circle around the camp. My breath was visible in the cold night air. The fire crackled behind me. I could hear the wind moving through the trees, but nothing else. I was about to head back inside when I saw them. Footprints. Not mine. They were barefoot, human, but something was wrong. The prints were long. The toes stretched out further than they should have been, like fingers, and they didn't make sense. The stride was too wide, like whatever made them had longer legs than any person should. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I checked the area again. The prints were still there, but they didn't lead anywhere. They just stopped, like whatever had made them had vanished into thin air. I was on edge for the rest of the day. I kept my rifle with me, barely leaving camp except to gather wood. The feeling of being watched was stronger now. It wasn't my imagination. That night, I didn't even try to sleep. I sat by the fire, watching the tree line, listening. At some point, I heard something. Not footsteps this time. A voice. It came from the trees, just outside the fire's glow. It was saying my name. Not like someone calling for me. Not like someone trying to get my attention. It was flat. Wrong. Like someone was trying to copy my voice but didn't know how to use it right. I gripped my rifle so hard my knuckles went white. The voice came again, closer. Still wrong. Still broken. Then I saw it. First, I thought it was a person. Tall. Thin. Standing just outside the firelight, half hidden by the trees. But as I stared, my stomach dropped. Its legs were too long. Its arms hung too low. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, like it wasn't used to holding it upright. And its eyes, they caught the firelight like an animal's. I didn't move. It didn't move. Then it took a step forward. The moment it moved, something in me snapped. I raised my rifle and fired. The gunshot shattered the silence. The thing jerked backward, but I wasn't sure if I hit it. It didn't make a sound. No scream, no grunt, nothing. Then it turned and ran. I've never seen anything move like that. It didn't run like a person. It didn't even run like an animal. It moved on all fours, its limbs bending the wrong way, its body twisting as it shot off into the trees. I didn't stay to find out if it was coming back. I grabbed what I could, my rifle, my knife, my pack, and I ran. I left my tent, my food, everything. I ran harder than I ever had in my life. I didn't stop until the sun came up. By then, I had no idea where I was. I had my GPS, but I barely looked at it. I just kept moving, putting as much distance between me and that thing as possible. It took me 2 more days to hike back to civilization. I barely slept. I barely ate. Every time the sun went down, I found a place to hide, rifle in hand, back against a tree. When I finally made it back to my truck, I drove straight home. I never reported it. Who would believe me? Some guy in the woods seeing things after spending too much time alone? I knew what I saw, and I knew I never wanted to see it again. I haven't been back to that part of the mountains since. I still go camping, but not as deep, not as far, and never alone. Because I know now, I wasn't alone out there. Not really. And whatever was out there that night, it knew my name. I never thought I'd go back to that place alone. The last time I planned a trip there, my dog, Jake, was still alive. He was a big old Labrador mix, with a gray muzzle and slow-moving joints, but he still wagged his tail like he was a puppy when I grabbed the camping gear. That last trip never happened. He passed before we could go. It felt wrong leaving without him. But months passed, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I owed him one last trip. I packed light. A tent, my sleeping bag, some food, my knife, and a flashlight. The same things I always brought. I took the old truck out of town, following the same winding roads I'd driven with Jake 100 times before. The sky was overcast, and the radio was just a low hum under the sound of the tires on pavement. I picked a quiet spot, far enough off the main roads that I wouldn't see another soul. I wasn't worried about people. I wasn't really worried about anything. I just wanted to be out there, where the world was quiet. I wanted to sit by the fire and remember my dog. The first few hours were peaceful. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and watched the trees sway in the wind. I cooked a little, ate without much of an appetite, and let the silence settle around me. The place had always been quiet, but now it felt different. It wasn't peaceful. It was empty. As the sun dipped below the tree line, I sat by the fire and stared into the flames. Jake would have been curled up next to me, his head on his paws, his ears flicking at every little sound in the woods. I thought I heard something in the distance, a rustling, maybe a snapping branch, but I told myself it was nothing, just the wind. I wasn't new to camping. I'd spent years out in places like this, miles away from towns or highways, alone except for Jake. I knew the sounds of the woods, the groan of trees, the whisper of leaves in the wind, the distant calls of animals. I also knew when something didn't sound right. The noise came again, not the usual movement of a raccoon or a deer. This was slower, heavier. I turned my flashlight on and pointed it toward the trees. Nothing, just darkness stretching between the trunks. The fire crackled behind me, and for a second, I thought about packing up and leaving, but I stayed. Maybe it was just my head playing tricks on me. Maybe I was just feeling off because this was the first time I'd been here without Jake. I forced myself to relax, letting the fire warm my hands as the night grew colder. The wind picked up, rattling the branches overhead. I could still hear something out there, though, something moving. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear it again. Something shifting in the undergrowth. Something watching. By morning, I felt like hell. My back ached from sleeping on the ground. My head throbbed from the lack of sleep, and my stomach was sour from the instant coffee I choked down for breakfast. I thought about packing up, but I told myself I was overreacting. I hiked a little, following the old trails I used to walk with Jake. His absence felt heavier out there. Every time I turned a corner, I expected to see him trotting ahead, looking back to make sure I was keeping up. The woods were still. Too still. Something was off. It wasn't just a feeling anymore. The birds weren't making a sound. There were no squirrels darting through the trees, no bugs buzzing in the air, just silence. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was just unsettled because I wasn't used to being out here alone. I kept walking. I found something a mile from camp. First, I thought it was a pile of branches, but as I got closer, I saw that they weren't branches at all. Bones. A lot of them. scattered in a rough circle. Some snapped in half like something had bitten clean through them. I didn't recognize what they were from. Some looked too big for deer, others too small for anything else that lived in these woods. I didn't stay long. I turned around and walked back to camp, faster than before. The feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. If anything, it was stronger. By the time I got back, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I started packing, shoving everything into my bag as quickly as I could. Something snapped in the woods behind me. I stopped, turned. Nothing. The wind had died. The trees weren't moving. Then I saw it. A shape just beyond the tree line, low to the ground, watching. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a coyote. I couldn't see it clearly, but I knew it wasn't right. I grabbed my bag and moved to the truck. I didn't run. Running triggers things. Predators. I walked, steady and slow, gripping my knife so tightly my knuckles ached. I heard it following. Not close. Not yet. I reached the truck, yanked the door open, and threw my bag inside. Then I looked back. It was closer, still watching. I got in, started the engine, and hit the gas. Gravel kicked up behind me as I sped down the dirt road, glancing in the mirror every few seconds. I didn't see it anymore, but I knew it was still there. I didn't stop driving until I saw the first signs of town. Street lights, houses, people. I pulled into my driveway, killed the engine, and sat there for a long time. My hands were still shaking. My head was pounding. I never went back. Whatever was out there, it wasn't meant to be seen. I should have never gone alone. I had been camping for years, ever since I was a kid. I liked going alone, and I liked going deep into places where other people didn't bother going. The more isolated, the better. That was part of the appeal. Being away from everything, from people, from the noise. That's why I picked this spot. It was deep in the backcountry of northern Arizona, in the middle of the Coconino National Forest. Tall pines, rocky cliffs, and long, winding dirt roads that few people ever took. It was late September, which meant the nights were getting cold, but the days were still warm. Perfect weather for camping. I had driven for hours, deeper and deeper into the forest, away from the usual campsites and tourist spots. Eventually, I found a narrow trail that cut through the trees and led to a clearing just big enough to park my truck. There was no one around for miles. No tire tracks, no signs of recent activity. Just me, my gear, and the wilderness. I set up my tent a little way off from the truck, closer to a tree line where the ground was soft with pine needles. I gathered some wood for a fire, cooked a simple meal, and settled in. Felt good to be alone. The air was crisp. The only sounds were the wind moving through the trees and the occasional distant call of an animal. By the time the sun dipped below the treetops, I had everything set for the night. My tent was sturdy, my gear was organized, and the fire was crackling. I sat by the flames, eating, staring into the dark woods beyond the glow of the fire. That's when I noticed something. It was subtle at first, a slight change in the way the forest sounded. The wind was still there, but the usual rustling of small animals moving through the underbrush had stopped. No crickets, no birds, nothing, just silence. I sat there listening. I wasn't scared, just alert. When you camp alone, you pay attention to these things. Sometimes, silence just meant a predator was nearby. A mountain lion, maybe a coyote. I wasn't worried. I had a rifle in the truck and a knife strapped to my belt. But then I heard a sound. It was faint, too faint to pinpoint. A soft, distant movement. Not the scurrying of an animal, but something else. Something deliberate. A crunch of dry leaves. A shift in the dirt. It was coming from the trees. I turned toward the sound, staring into the darkness. The firelight didn't reach far, but I could make out the shapes of trees, the uneven ground. I scanned the area, waiting, listening. Nothing. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe a branch had fallen somewhere in the distance. I turned back to the fire, but I didn't feel as relaxed as before. The feeling of being alone, the good kind, had changed. Now I felt watched. I tried to shake it off. I'd been alone in the woods 100 times before. Sometimes your mind messes with you. You start imagining things. I took a deep breath, focused on the fire, and let the warmth calm me. Then I heard it again, closer this time. A footstep, not a coyote, not a deer, a footstep. I froze, my hand gripping my knife. I turned my head slowly, scanning the tree line. The fire crackled behind me, casting shadows that danced over the ground. I didn't move. I barely even breathed. Nothing, just trees. I stood up, trying to act casual, like I was just stretching my legs. I grabbed my flashlight from the ground, clicked it on, and aimed it toward the trees. A beam of white light cut through the darkness. Nothing. I swept the beam back and forth, checking the bushes, the gaps between the trees. I held it there for a long moment, waiting. Still nothing. I let out a breath, shaking my head. Maybe an animal had been moving around and had stopped when it saw the light. Maybe it had been my own paranoia. I turned off the flashlight and sat back down, but I kept my knife in my hand. The fire burned low, and I fed it another log, watching the flames grow. The feeling of unease didn't go away, but I forced myself to relax. Then, just as I was about to turn in for the night, I heard it again. But this time, it wasn't a footstep. It was breathing. Somewhere beyond the firelight, something was breathing. Slow, steady, controlled. Not heavy like an animal. Not quick like a frightened deer. Just deep, measured breaths. I felt ice crawl up my spine. I stayed completely still, my ears straining to pinpoint the source. It was close, maybe 20 feet away, somewhere just beyond my sight. I flicked my flashlight back on and aimed it toward the sound. Nothing, but the breathing stopped. I held the beam there, my heart pounding, my grip tightening on the knife. I scanned the trees, moving the light in slow, deliberate passes. Still nothing. Then, just as I was about to turn back to the fire, I saw it. A shape, not fully visible, just at the edge of the light, half hidden behind a tree. Person, standing completely still. I didn't move, neither did they. My mind raced. There was no reason for someone to be out here. No reason for them to be standing there like that. Watching, I felt a wave of adrenaline surge through me, my instincts screaming at me to act. I gripped my knife tighter, stepped back toward my truck. If I needed to, I could grab my rifle. Then the figure moved. Not toward me, not away, just shifting like they were adjusting their stance. Still watching. My breathing was fast now. I backed up another step, keeping my light on them. My truck was just a few feet away. If I could get to it, get inside, grab my rifle. Then the figure turned. Not quickly, slowly, deliberately, and walked back into the trees. I watched until the darkness swallowed them completely. Then I ran. I grabbed my gear, tossed it in the truck without packing it properly. The fire was still burning as I jumped into the driver's seat and locked the doors. I didn't wait. I started the engine, threw it into reverse, and backed out of there so fast I nearly hit a tree. My tires kicked up dirt as I turned onto the narrow trail, heading back the way I came. I checked my mirrors. Nothing. But I didn't stop. I drove through the night, not slowing down until I hit the main road miles away. Only then did I pull over, my hands shaking on the wheel, my heart still pounding. I didn't go back. I never went back. I don't know who was out there, and I don't want to know. It started as a simple plan. My gym partner, Kevin, and I had been talking about getting outside more, doing something different from our usual workouts. We had been lifting weights together for almost 2 years, pushing each other to new personal bests, spotting each other on heavy sets, and keeping each other accountable. But we had both realized that our fitness routines had become repetitive. Gym, protein shakes, work, sleep, repeat. Kevin was the one who brought up camping. He had done a bit of it in the past, said he wanted to get back into it. I hadn't camped since I was a kid, but the idea of spending a weekend out in nature, away from everything, sounded good. I figured it would be a nice way to challenge ourselves in a different way. Hiking, chopping wood, setting up camp, cooking out in the open. Something different from the usual. We decided on a place a few hours away, deep in the mountains. It wasn't a touristy area. No campgrounds with families or RVs. Just miles of thick trees, dirt roads, and a few small lakes scattered throughout. Kevin had some gear, an old tent, sleeping bags, a couple of hunting knives, and a hatchet. I went out and bought a new backpack, a water filter, and some other basic supplies. Neither of us was an expert, but we weren't complete idiots either. The drive up was long, the roads getting rougher as we got deeper into the mountains. The last stretch was nothing but dirt and gravel, winding up and down hills, with no signs of civilization. The last house we had passed was at least an hour behind us. There were no power lines, no street signs, just trees and more trees. We finally reached the spot Kevin had in mind. A small clearing near a lake, surrounded by dense forest. The place was dead quiet. No traffic, no distant hum of city life. Just the occasional chirp of birds and the rustling of leaves when the wind picked up. We set up our tent near the tree line, close enough to the water to make filtering it easy, but far enough that we weren't right on the shore. The first few hours were great. We gathered wood, built a fire, cooked some food, and just enjoyed being out there. The sun was setting by the time we finished eating, and the temperature was dropping fast. That's something I hadn't really thought about. How quickly it gets cold when you're out in the middle of nowhere, away from concrete and pavement, holding on to the heat of the day. Kevin and I sat by the fire, talking about random stuff, our workouts, our jobs, people we knew. It was nice to just sit there and not worry about anything. But even then, there was something about the silence that felt different. Like it wasn't just quiet, it was too quiet. No insects buzzing, no owls hooting, no distant sounds of animals moving through the trees. Just the crackling of the fire and nothing else. I didn't say anything about it. I figured maybe I was just too used to the background noise of the city, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was around midnight when we decided to call it a night. The fire had died down, leaving behind a pile of glowing embers. We crawled into the tent, zipped up our sleeping bags, and tried to get some sleep. First, everything was fine. The air was cold, but I was warm in my sleeping bag. The ground was uncomfortable, but I expected that. I was just starting to drift off when I heard something. Footsteps. Not animal footsteps. These were slow, deliberate human footsteps. I opened my eyes, staring up at the dark fabric of the tent. I wasn't sure if I had really heard something or if my brain was just playing tricks on me. I held my breath, listening. There it was again. Crunch, crunch. Leaves and twigs breaking underfoot. Close, too close. I turned my head toward Kevin. He wasn't moving, but I could tell he was awake. His breathing had changed, short, shallow breaths, like he was listening too. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to make a sound, but my heart was pounding so hard I felt like it was shaking my whole body. The footsteps stopped, right outside the tent. I could feel the presence of something or someone, just beyond the thin layer of fabric separating us from the outside world. Then came the worst part, the breathing. Slow, heavy, deep. Whoever or whatever it was, they were just standing there, breathing, not moving, just standing. Kevin's hand moved slightly toward the knife he had brought. I could see the outline of his fingers gripping the handle. We stayed like that for what felt like forever. The breathing continued, slow, steady. Then, finally, the footsteps started again, moving away from the tent. We waited. 5 minutes, 10, 15, nothing, just silence again. Kevin finally moved, unzipping the tent as quietly as he could. He peeked out, then slowly crawled outside. I followed. The fire was completely out. The air was freezing. We grabbed our flashlights and swept the area around the tent. And then we saw them. Footprints. Deep, clear footprints in the dirt, circling our tent. Not boots, bare feet, and they weren't small. I felt my stomach drop. This wasn't just some lost hiker. This wasn't an animal. This was someone watching us. Kevin and I looked at each other. Neither of us said a word. We just started packing. Fast. We tore down the tent, threw everything into our packs, and grabbed our knives. We didn't even bother tying things down properly. We just wanted to get out of there. The hike back to the truck was brutal. The trail was dark, uneven, and filled with roots and rocks that kept trying to trip us up. Every few minutes, we stopped listening. We didn't hear anything, but we couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. When we finally reached the truck, Kevin practically jumped into the driver's seat while I threw our bags into the back. The moment the engine roared to life, he slammed the gas, and we tore out of there, speeding down the dirt road like our lives depended on it. And maybe they did. We didn't stop driving until we were miles away, back on paved roads, surrounded by streetlights and other cars. Only then did we finally take a breath. We never talked about it after that. Not really. We went back to our normal lives, back to the gym, back to our routines. But we never went camping again. And I still think about that night, about the footprints, about the breathing, and about the fact that whoever it was, they never ran. They never made a sound. They just stood there, watching, waiting. I don't know why I thought it was a good idea. Maybe I just wanted to prove something to myself. Maybe I was bored. Maybe I was just stupid. But I can tell you now, camping in a graveyard is not the kind of thing you do for fun. It was late September, and I had some time off work. I had been doing a lot of solo camping lately, mostly in forests and remote areas where I wouldn't run into anyone. I liked the isolation, the quiet. I liked feeling like I was the only person in the world. I was looking for a new spot to set up for the night, and I remembered an old graveyard about 10 miles outside town. It wasn't one of those well-kept places with headstones standing in neat rows. This was an abandoned burial ground, mostly overgrown, forgotten, and barely mentioned by anyone. I had passed by it a few times while hiking and figured it could be an interesting spot. I wasn't thinking about ghosts. I don't believe in that, but I did have a weird feeling about the place. The kind of feeling that makes your stomach twist, even though you can't explain why. I should have listened to that feeling. I packed light, just my tent, a sleeping bag, some food, and a flashlight. The hike wasn't long, maybe an hour, but by the time I reached the graveyard, the sky was already turning orange with the setting sun. The place was worse than I remembered. The graves were barely visible, most of the headstones broken or covered in moss. Some had sunk into the earth. The ground was uneven, filled with dips and hollows where the land had shifted over time. I walked around, looking for a flat spot to set up my tent. I tried not to step directly on the graves, but it was impossible to avoid them completely. The whole place felt wrong, like I wasn't supposed to be there. I shook it off and pitched my tent near the edge of the cemetery, where a few trees gave me some cover. It was a good spot, out of the wind, and with enough open space around me to see if anyone or anything came too close. I started a small fire with the dry wood I had collected earlier and sat down to eat. By the time it got dark, the fire was the only source of light around me. There was no moon, no streetlights, nothing but the flickering glow of the flames. The shadows between the graves stretched long and dark, and the air felt colder than it should have. I didn't like the way the graveyard looked at night. It wasn't just the darkness, it was the silence. In the woods, you hear things at night. Crickets, owls, the wind moving through the trees. But here there was nothing, just dead air. I sat by the fire for a while, trying to shake the uneasy feeling crawling up my spine. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was letting the setting get to me. But I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder. Every time I turned my head, I felt like I had just missed seeing something move. I finished eating, put out the fire, and climbed into my tent. It was cold inside, colder than it should have been. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag and closed my eyes, trying to sleep. It didn't work. I wasn't scared. I told myself that over and over, but my body wasn't listening. My heart was beating too fast, my muscles tense like I was waiting for something. I turned onto my side, trying to get comfortable, but no matter what I did, I couldn't relax. That's when I heard it. Faint sound. Not a voice, not an animal. A soft shifting of earth. Like something heavy was moving just outside my tent. I held my breath and listened. Nothing. Just silence again. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe the ground settled, or a rock shifted somewhere in the dark. I exhaled slowly and closed my eyes. Then I heard it again. A slow, deliberate movement. This time it was closer. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. The sound stopped, but the silence wasn't normal anymore. It was heavier, pressed down on me. I felt like something was standing right outside the tent, watching, waiting. I reached for my flashlight. My hand shook as I gripped it, but I didn't turn it on yet. I listened for any other sounds. Nothing. I took a deep breath and switched on the light. The beam cut through the darkness, lighting up the inside of my tent. I pointed it at the fabric walls, looking for shadows or movement outside. Still nothing. I swallowed hard and unzipped the tent just a little, just enough to peek out. The graveyard was exactly the same as before. No movement, no signs of life. I stepped out of the tent. The air was cold against my skin, but I ignored it. I swept the flashlight around, checking between the graves, behind the trees. There was no one. I told myself it was just my nerves, that I was scaring myself. I crawled back into the tent and zipped it up tight. I lay there in the dark, gripping the flashlight like a weapon, waiting for sleep to come. And then I heard the breathing. It was right outside my tent. Slow, heavy breaths. Someone or something was standing inches away from me. I didn't move. My body felt frozen. My chest so tight I could barely breathe. The sound continued, steady and calm, like whatever was out there knew I wasn't going anywhere. Then the breathing stopped, and the tent moved. It was a small shift, barely anything, but I felt it. The fabric stretched inward, like a hand had pressed against it. I snapped. I unzipped the tent in one violent motion, shining the flashlight directly at whatever was outside. Nothing. The graveyard was empty.
No footprints.
No signs of movement. I didn't waste any more time. I grabbed my sleeping bag, my flashlight, and my knife, and I ran. I didn't pack up my tent. I didn't stop to check behind me. I just ran. The night was silent, but I could feel something watching me. I didn't know what. I didn't want to know. I ran until I was out of the graveyard, until I was back on the trail, until I saw the first hints of daylight breaking over the horizon. Only then did I stop. I stood there, breathless, heart pounding, staring back at the graveyard in the distance. It looked normal, ordinary. I don't know what was out there. I don't know what I heard, what I felt. But I know one thing for sure. I will never go back. I was no stranger to the woods. I had spent most of my life out there, cutting trees, hunting, and living off the land. The thick forest was where I felt at home, where the air was clean, and the noise of the modern world couldn't reach me. It was the only place where I could think, where I could breathe without feeling the weight of everything pressing down on me. It was late autumn when I decided to head out for a camping trip. I wanted a few days alone, away from everything. I packed up my truck with my usual gear: axe, rifle, sleeping bag, enough food for a week, though I planned to hunt as well. I had a spot deep in the woods, a place few people knew about. It was about a 4-hour drive from town, and then another hour on foot. There was an old logging trail leading most of the way, but it had been overgrown for years. By the time I reached the trailhead, the sky was heavy with clouds, a dull gray stretching endlessly over the treetops. The air smelled like damp earth, like the promise of rain. I slung my pack over my shoulder, locked up the truck, and started walking. The deeper I went, the quieter everything became. That was normal. The forest had its own rhythm, its own way of breathing. But something felt different this time. I couldn't place it at first, just a small feeling in the back of my head, like something wasn't right. I brushed it off and kept moving. By the time I reached my spot, the light was fading. I set up my tent near a small clearing, close to the edge of a creek. The water was running low, but it was clean. I collected some wood, built a fire, and sat down to eat. The warmth of the flames kept the cold away, and for a while, I let myself relax. Then I heard it, a sound that didn't belong. It wasn't an animal. I knew the sounds of the forest, the rustling of small creatures in the underbrush, the distant call of an owl, the wind shifting through the trees. This was different. It was distant, but sharp, like something heavy moving through the woods. Slow, deliberate. I froze, listening. Nothing. I waited for a while, then went back to eating. Maybe a deer, maybe a bear. They usually kept their distance, but it wasn't unheard of. The night stretched on, the fire burned low, and I finally crawled into my tent. The wind picked up, making the trees groan and sway. Somewhere far off, I heard the cry of a coyote. I closed my eyes and let the sound lull me to sleep. I woke up to the sound of something moving outside. Not an animal. I knew that instantly. The footsteps were too slow, too heavy. Not cautious like a predator, not quick like a deer. Just slow, steady steps, circling my campsite. I reached for my rifle, my heart hammering. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a dull red glow across the clearing. I stayed still, listening, waiting. Then the steps stopped. I held my breath. Nothing. For a long time, there was only silence. Then, after what felt like forever, I heard the sound of footsteps retreating into the woods. I didn't move. I sat there in the dark, gripping my rifle, waiting for something else. But nothing came. Eventually, exhaustion took over. I lay back down, rifle close to my chest, and forced myself to sleep. The next morning, I stepped out of my tent and looked around. The ground was damp from the night's rain. My firewood pile had been disturbed. Not much, just enough to notice. And then I saw them. Footprints. Human, but barefoot. The tracks circled my campsite, stopping just a few feet from my tent. Then they led off into the woods, disappearing into the undergrowth. I felt a chill run through me. I had camped in these woods for years. I had never seen another person out this deep. It was too far from the main trails, too difficult to reach unless you knew exactly where you were going. I packed up my things quickly. My plan had been to stay for a few days, but something told me I needed to leave. I kept my rifle loaded, my axe strapped to my belt. As I hiked back, I kept checking over my shoulder. The feeling of being watched never left. By the time I reached my truck, the sky had darkened again. Rain started falling as I threw my gear in the back. I climbed into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I pulled onto the narrow road leading back to town, I glanced into my rearview mirror, and there, just at the edge of the trees, something moved. A figure, barefoot, watching. I didn't stop. I didn't look back again. I just drove. I never went back to that spot. I still camp, still spend time in the woods, but not there, never there. Some places are meant to be left alone. I had been planning the trip for months. Work had been a grind, and I needed a break. Something real, something away from the noise of people, phones, and emails. I wanted silence, just the sound of the wind through the trees and the crackling of a campfire. Nothing else. I found the spot on an old forum post. Some guy had mentioned a place deep in the woods, past a logging road that hadn't been used in years. No marked trails, no designated campsites, just pure wilderness. It sounded perfect. The only way in was a rough dirt path that barely passed as a road, and even then, you'd have to hike in the last few miles. It was late October, and the air was starting to cool. I packed my truck with everything I needed: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, and a rifle. Not because I was expecting trouble, but because it was bare country, and I wasn't taking any chances. The drive was long. I left town early in the morning, and by late afternoon, I was miles into nowhere. The road had turned from pavement to gravel, then to dirt, and then to something barely recognizable as a road at all. Trees loomed high on both sides, blocking out most of the sunlight. The deeper I went, the more I started to notice the stillness. No cars, no other people, just the dull hum of my truck's engine. After another hour, I finally reached the spot where I had to continue on foot. I pulled over, turned off the engine, and let the silence settle in. I grabbed my backpack, shouldered my rifle, and started walking. The trail, or what was left of it, was overgrown. Bushes scraped against my pants, and tree branches snagged at my pack. I kept my pace steady, following the GPS on my phone. There was no service out here, but I had downloaded an offline map. The sun was already low by the time I found a good place to set up camp. It was a small clearing, surrounded by dense trees, with just enough space for my tent and a fire pit. A small creek ran nearby, its water barely making a sound as it trickled over rocks. I set up quickly, making sure everything was secure. The fire took a few tries, but soon enough, flames flickered against the darkening sky. I sat back, ate a quick meal, and listened to the sounds of the forest. It was peaceful, exactly what I had been looking for. But as the hours passed and the night grew colder, something felt off. At first, I told myself it was just the unfamiliarity of the place. New surroundings always take some getting used to, but as I sat there, staring into the fire, I realized what was wrong. The woods were too quiet. I had been in the wilderness plenty of times before. At night, you hear things, crickets, owls, the occasional rustle of a small animal in the underbrush. But here, there was nothing, just silence. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe the forest was just naturally quiet at this time of year. But deep down, something in my gut told me otherwise. I double-checked my rifle, making sure it was loaded, then crawled into my tent. The fire was still burning outside, casting a soft glow against the fabric. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to push away the unease creeping up my spine. I must have dozed off at some point because I woke up to the sound of something moving outside. It wasn't loud, just the faint crunch of leaves, slow and deliberate. I held my breath, listening. It wasn't the wind. The steps were too steady, too controlled. I reached for my rifle, keeping my movements quiet. My heart pounded as I tried to convince myself it was just an animal. A deer, maybe, or a raccoon sniffing around for scraps. Then I heard it again. This time, closer. I swallowed hard, gripping my rifle tighter. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to stay still, to listen. The sound stopped. I waited, barely breathing, my ears straining in the darkness. Minutes passed, maybe more. Then, just when I started to think I had imagined it, something tapped against my tent. Not hard, just a single light tap, like a finger. I felt my blood run cold. I wanted to call out, to make my presence known, but I held back. I didn't want to give away that I was awake. Instead, I slowly, carefully, reached for my flashlight. I clicked it on, aiming it toward the tent wall. Nothing, just the smooth, undisturbed fabric. No shadows, no movement, but the feeling didn't go away. I lay there for hours, waiting for something else to happen, but nothing did. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep. Morning came, and with it, a strange sense of unease. I stepped outside, rifle in hand, and scanned the area. My fire had burned low, leaving only smoldering embers. The ground was covered in fallen leaves, untouched except for, I froze, footprints, not animal tracks, boot prints. They circled my tent once before disappearing into the trees. A chill ran down my spine. I was miles from the nearest road. No one should have been out here. No one but me. I tried to think logically. Maybe a hiker had wandered through. Maybe they saw my tent and got curious. But that didn't explain the tapping. I made up my mind then and there. I was leaving. I packed quickly, stuffing my gear into my pack with shaking hands. My heart pounded as I stomped out the fire, slung my rifle over my shoulder, and started back toward my truck. The whole way, I felt like I was being watched. I kept checking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing there, just beyond the trees. But there was never anyone there. When I finally saw my truck through the trees, relief flooded through me. But then I stopped. The driver's side door was open. I knew I had locked it. I was sure of it. I gripped my rifle tighter, scanning the area. The truck was untouched otherwise. No signs of forced entry. Nothing missing. Just the door hanging open. I didn't waste time. I jumped in, locked the doors, and started the engine. The tires kicked up dirt as I sped down the trail, my eyes darting between the road and the mirrors. I didn't slow down until I hit pavement, until the trees thinned and the world felt normal again. Only then did I let myself breathe. I never went back, never tried to figure out who or what had been out there with me. All I know is that I wasn't alone, and whoever it was, they wanted me to know it. I had been planning the trip for weeks. A solo camping weekend in the hills of Northumberland, away from everything, work, people, noise. I wanted the isolation, the silence, the space to breathe. I had done this kind of thing before, but always in more well-known spots, places where there was at least some chance of bumping into another camper or a hiker. This time, I had chosen something more remote. I had found the location through an old map. A barely marked clearing deep in the woods, miles from any proper trails, far from the usual campsites. It was supposed to be untouched, forgotten, a place where no one really went anymore. That was the appeal. I arrived early in the afternoon, parked my car at a lay-by off a single-track road, and hiked in with my gear. The trees swallowed the last signs of civilization behind me, and soon it was just me and the forest. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. Even the sound of birds faded until all I could hear was the wind through the branches and the crunch of my boots on damp earth. It took nearly 2 hours to reach the spot. A small clearing, surrounded by dense woodland. The ground was soft, covered in moss and old leaves, and there was a narrow stream trickling nearby. It felt untouched, exactly what I wanted. I set up my tent, got a small fire going, and cooked an easy meal. As the sun dipped, the cold crept in fast, the kind of damp chill that settles deep in your bones. I wrapped up, sat by the fire, and let the silence settle around me. That's when I noticed it. Something felt off. At first, I couldn't place it. Just a feeling, a slight shift in the air, a pressure at the back of my skull. I told myself it was nothing, just the quiet messing with me. But then I realized something had changed. The forest had gone silent. Not just quieter, but completely dead. No wind, no rustling leaves, no distant sounds of animals. Just nothing. I scanned the tree line. My fire cast long shadows, flickering against the trunks, but I couldn't see anything unusual. The feeling stayed, though, like being watched. I shook it off, probably just my mind playing tricks. I had been alone for hours, maybe my brain was reacting to that. I forced myself to relax, added more wood to the fire, and eventually climbed into my tent. Sleep didn't come easy. I kept waking up, convinced I had heard something outside. A branch snapping, a shuffle of movement. But every time I listened, there was only silence. At some point, I must have drifted off because when I woke up again, it was pitch black. And this time, I knew I wasn't imagining it. There was something moving outside. Not an animal. The footsteps were too heavy, too deliberate. Slow, measured steps circling my tent. I lay completely still, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. The fire had burned low, leaving only faint embers, not enough to see anything clearly. I reached for my knife, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped. Then, a sound that turned my stomach to ice. Breathing, just outside my tent. Slow, deep, deliberate. I gripped the knife tighter, every muscle in my body locked. The fabric of the tent was thin. If someone wanted to get in, there was nothing stopping them. I waited, listened, tried to make sense of it. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the breathing stopped. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours, every nerve on edge, waiting for something else to happen. But nothing did. Eventually, the first hints of dawn crept through the trees. I forced myself to move, to unzip the tent just enough to see outside. Nothing. The fire was cold, the clearing empty. No footprints, no disturbed ground. Just the forest, silent and still, like nothing had happened. But I knew it had. I packed up fast, stuffing my gear into my bag, constantly checking over my shoulder. The feeling hadn't left. I had been watched. I had been followed. I had heard something that shouldn't have been there, and I wasn't waiting around to see if it came back. The hike out was the longest I had ever done. Every snap of a branch, every shift of shadows had me on edge. I didn't stop, didn't look back. When I reached my car, I threw my gear inside, locked the doors, and drove without stopping. Only when I was miles away, back on proper roads, did I finally breathe. I don't know what was out there that night. I don't want to know, but I never went camping alone again, and I never went back to that place. I had been working as a cop for over 10 years when I decided to take a short break. It wasn't an official vacation, just a few days off to clear my head. The job had started to wear me down. Long shifts, the constant weight of responsibility, the things I had seen. I needed some space to breathe, away from the city, away from people. I chose to go camping in a forest I had visited before years ago. It was about a 3-hour drive from home, far enough to feel isolated but close enough that I could get back if I needed to. The place wasn't a tourist attraction, just a stretch of deep woods with an old, barely used dirt road leading in. The last time I had been there, I had camped near a small, slow-moving river, surrounded by thick trees that blocked out most of the sky. It had been peaceful, exactly what I needed now. I packed light, just the basics. A tent, a sleeping bag, some food, water, a knife, and my sidearm. I never went anywhere unarmed, especially not in the middle of nowhere. Even out here, there was always the chance of running into trouble, whether it was a wild animal or something else. I reached the forest late in the afternoon. The road leading in was just as rough as I remembered, filled with potholes and half covered by fallen leaves and branches. I drove slowly, watching for anything that might puncture a tire. After about 20 minutes of navigating the narrow path, I reached a clearing where I could park. I got out and stretched, breathing in the cool air. It was quiet, just the wind moving through the trees and the distant sound of running water. I grabbed my pack and locked the truck before heading toward the river. The spot I had in mind was another 15-minute walk from where I had parked, but I didn't mind. I wanted to be deep enough into the woods that I wouldn't see or hear anyone. As I walked, I noticed how overgrown everything had become. The path I had taken last time was barely visible, the trees and underbrush thicker than I remembered. It made the place feel even more isolated, like no one had been out here in years. By the time I reached the river, the sun was starting to set. I found a flat spot near the water and started setting up my tent. It took longer than I expected. The ground was uneven, and I had to clear away a few fallen branches, but eventually, I got everything in place. Once the tent was up, I gathered some wood and started a fire. I sat by it, eating a simple meal, listening to the sounds of the forest around me. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that settled into your bones once the sun went down. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and watched the fire flicker. Felt good to be alone. No radios, no paperwork, no calls in the middle of the night. Just me, the woods, and the sound of the river. But as the night went on, I started feeling off. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just a sense that something was wrong. The kind of feeling I had learned to trust on the job. My instincts had saved my life more than once, and right now they were telling me to be alert. I glanced around, scanning the tree line. The firelight only reached so far, and beyond that was nothing but darkness. I listened carefully, trying to pick out anything unusual. At first, I heard nothing but the wind and the water. But then something else, a branch snapping. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. I turned my head slowly, focusing on the direction of the sound. Then silence. I stayed still, waiting, Sometimes it was just an animal passing through. Other times it was something else. Minutes passed. The fire crackled. The wind moved through the trees, but there were no more sounds. I let out a slow breath and reached for my gun, keeping it close, just in case. I stayed up longer than I had planned, watching the darkness, listening, but nothing happened. Eventually, I forced myself to get into the tent. I zipped it up, keeping my weapon within reach, and lay down. I didn't sleep well. Every little sound had me on edge. At some point, I must have dozed off, because when I opened my eyes, it was early morning. The fire had burned down to embers, and the forest was quiet. I sat up and stretched, my back sore from the hard ground. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, breathing in the cold morning air. That's when I saw it. Footprints. They weren't mine. The tracks were fresh, leading from the tree line to just a few feet away from my tent. They were spaced out like someone had been walking slowly, carefully. I scanned the area, but there was no one in sight. Whoever had been here was gone. I followed the tracks, moving cautiously. They led toward the trees but disappeared after a short distance. The ground was covered in leaves, making it hard to see where they had gone. I felt the hair on my neck stand up. Someone had been watching me while I slept. I checked my gear, making sure nothing was missing. Everything was where I had left it, but that didn't make me feel any better. Whoever had come this close hadn't been trying to rob me. They had just been there, watching. I packed up my things quickly. I had planned to stay another night, but that wasn't happening now. I wasn't about to sit around and wait to see who would come back. As I made my way back to the truck, I kept looking over my shoulder. Every sound, every movement made my pulse jump. When I finally reached the clearing, I saw something that stopped me cold. My truck. The driver's side door was open. I was sure I had locked it. I pulled my gun and approached slowly, checking around the vehicle. No one was there. I looked inside. Nothing was missing, but on the driver's seat, there was something that hadn't been there before. A single old key, rusted, worn. I picked it up carefully, my mind racing. Who had been out here, and why leave this? I scanned the tree line one last time before getting into the truck and locking the doors. I started the engine and pulled onto the dirt road, driving faster than I should have. I didn't stop until I was back on the highway, the trees fading into the distance behind me. I never went back to that place. I never figured out who had been there, watching me in the dark. And I never found out what that key was for. But I still have it. And sometimes I wonder if someone is waiting for me to use it. It had been a long time since I last went camping. Life had kept me busy, and I hadn't had a reason to pack up and head out into the woods like I used to. But when my cousin Jason called me up and told me he wanted to spend a weekend outdoors, away from everything, I figured it would be a good idea. We both grew up spending time in the woods, hunting, fishing, setting up camp deep in the trees where no one else would bother us. We picked a spot far from town, somewhere off the main roads where we wouldn't run into other campers. Jason said he'd found an old logging road that led to a small clearing near a river. It was the perfect spot, quiet, isolated, with enough tree cover to keep the wind down. The weather had been decent all week, but the forecast called for rain that night. We didn't care. We'd camped in the rain before, and we knew how to set up properly. We packed tarps, extra clothes, and made sure our tents were waterproof. It was supposed to be a short trip, just 2 nights, long enough to get away, enjoy the quiet, and maybe do a little fishing. The drive out took nearly 3 hours. The road leading to the spot was rough, barely a road at all, more like a pair of deep ruts cutting through the trees. The further we went, the less traveled it looked. Grass grew thick in the middle of the path, and fallen branches littered the way. At one point, I had to get out and move a downed tree just so we could keep going. When we finally arrived, the spot was just as Jason described, small, but enough space for the truck and our tents. The river was about 50 yards away, cutting through the woods like a dark ribbon. Tall pines loomed over us, their branches thick enough to block out the sky. We set up quickly, The tents went up first, then a tarp over the fire pit in case the rain started early. We gathered firewood, stacking enough to last through the night. The air was heavy, thick with the promise of rain, but there was no wind, no sign of a storm rolling in just yet. By the time the fire was going, the sun had started dipping below the trees. The temperature dropped fast. We cooked some food, ate, and sat back, watching the fire burn low. That was when we heard the first sound. It was faint, distant, something moving in the woods beyond the firelight. At first, I thought it was just the normal sounds of the forest. Animals moving through the brush, twigs snapping under their weight. But this was different. It wasn't random. It wasn't the occasional rustle of leaves or the scurry of a small animal. It was steady, deliberate. Jason noticed it too. I could tell by the way he kept glancing toward the trees, his face half lit by the fire. We didn't say anything. There was no need to. We both knew the woods, knew how to listen. The sounds continued, slow, rhythmic, too heavy for a deer, too controlled for something like a raccoon. The fire crackled, sending up a spray of sparks. I turned my head just slightly, keeping my eyes on the dark spaces between the trees. Then it stopped. Everything went quiet. The normal sounds of the forest, crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, faded into complete silence. I don't know how long we sat there, staring into the darkness. Maybe a minute, maybe more. Then, from somewhere beyond the trees, we heard it. A single sharp crack, like a branch breaking underfoot. Jason and I both stood at the same time. My heart pounded against my ribs. I scanned the tree line, trying to make out any movement. Nothing, but I could feel it. Something was there. We grabbed our flashlights and pointed them toward the trees. The beams cut through the dark, lighting up the trunks, the undergrowth, but nothing else. Still, I felt it. We stood there, frozen, waiting. The fire popped behind us, but otherwise, the silence held. Then the rain started. A light drizzle at first, tapping against the tarp, soaking into the ground. Within minutes, it was pouring. Jason turned back toward the fire, tossing more wood on to keep it from dying out. I kept my flashlight aimed at the trees. The feeling hadn't gone away. If anything, it was stronger now. We decided to turn in early. The rain made it miserable to sit outside, and neither of us felt comfortable staying by the fire. I climbed into my tent, zipped the door shut, and listened. The rain drummed against the fabric, loud enough to drown out most other sounds. But underneath it, I swore I could hear something moving. I barely slept. Every little sound had me wide awake, gripping the knife I kept in my sleeping bag. Then, sometime in the early morning hours, I heard it again. Closer this time. Heavy footsteps. They stopped just outside my tent. I held my breath. The rain poured, masking the world beyond the thin layer of fabric between me and whatever was out there. Then the zipper moved. Not fast, not yanked open, just a slight tug. I bolted upright, grabbing my flashlight and flicking it on. Nothing. I listened. The rain covered up most noises, but the heavy feeling in my chest told me something was still there. I waited, holding my breath. Then I heard Jason's tent unzip. Not fast, not in a way that made sense. Slow, deliberate. I threw my flashlight beam toward his tent. The zipper was halfway down, but I couldn't see inside. I didn't move. Then, after what felt like forever, the zipper moved back up. Slow. It closed completely. I wanted to call out to Jason, but my gut told me not to. Instead, I stayed frozen, gripping my knife, waiting. The rain kept falling. The feeling didn't go away. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I must have dozed off. When I woke up, the sun was rising, the rain had stopped, and everything felt normal again. Jason stepped out of his tent, rubbing his eyes. I stared at him. He stared back. Neither of us said a word. We packed up quickly. No breakfast, no fire. Just threw everything into the truck and left. We never talked about it. Never went back to that spot. But I know what I felt that night. And I know Jason felt it too. Because when I finally got the courage to ask him about it, months later, he just shook his head and said, I never unzipped my tent, and that was the last time we ever camped together. There you go. Ultra long, highly detailed, and as realistic as possible. Let me know if you want another one with a different scenario. I had always liked camping alone. It was something I had done since I was a teenager, and even in my late 30s, it remained a way to clear my mind. I had been living in France for the past few years, working remotely, and took every chance I could to head out into nature. That summer, I decided to camp in the forests near the Pyrenees, a little off the usual hiking trails. I had done my research and picked an area that wasn't too remote but still quiet enough to avoid crowds. I planned to camp for 3 nights before heading back to the small town where I had parked my car. I arrived in the late afternoon, the warm air carrying the scent of pine and damp soil. The sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows as I hiked. My pack was heavy with supplies, enough food, a sturdy tent, a good sleeping bag, and a small camping stove. I had been in these types of forests before, and nothing about them felt unusual. It was just another camping trip. By the time I reached a suitable clearing, the sun was low in the sky. It was a good spot. Flat ground, no immediate signs of wildlife, and a small stream nearby for water. I set up my tent, got a fire going, and cooked a simple meal. As darkness settled in, the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional distant hoot of an owl. The first night was uneventful. I woke up early, had some coffee, and spent the day hiking around the area. The forest was dense, with towering trees and thick undergrowth, but nothing seemed out of place. I saw a few deer tracks, some birds, and the usual signs of small animals, but no people. It was exactly what I had wanted, quiet and isolated. It was on the second evening that I first noticed something strange. As I was sitting by the fire, I had the feeling I was being watched. It was that subtle awareness that you can't quite explain, like the sensation of eyes on you even when you can't see anyone. I glanced around, but the forest was dark beyond the fire's glow. The feeling didn't go away, but I tried to push it aside. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I had camped alone countless times, and paranoia could creep in when you were deep in the woods. I went to bed, making sure to zip up my tent tightly. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. I didn't know what had disturbed me at first, but then I heard it, a faint rustling just outside the tent. Not the wind, not an animal scurrying through the undergrowth, but something deliberate. I held my breath, straining to listen. The sound stopped. I waited, my heart pounding in my chest. After a few minutes of silence, I convinced myself it must have been a fox or some other small animal. I turned over and forced myself to sleep. The next morning, I checked around my campsite. There were no obvious signs of anything unusual, no footprints, no disturbed areas. I still couldn't shake the feeling, though. By midday, I decided to move to a different spot, about a mile deeper into the woods. It wasn't a huge distance, but I figured if there had been someone nearby, they wouldn't know where I had gone. That night, I made sure my fire was burning a little longer before putting it out. I sat outside my tent for a while, listening carefully. The forest was normal, branches creaking, the occasional distant movement of an animal. Nothing strange. I eventually went into the tent, zipped myself in, and laid down, but I couldn't relax. I felt on edge, like I was waiting for something to happen, and then it did. It started with soft footsteps. Not from an animal, these were slow, deliberate. My whole body went tense. The steps circled my tent, crunching softly on the forest floor. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry. The footsteps would stop for a while, then start again, circling. I felt trapped. My knife was in my bag, just out of reach. My headlamp was next to me, but I didn't want to turn it on and give away that I was awake. The footsteps stopped. I listened, my heart hammering in my ears. I was certain someone was standing just outside my tent. Minutes passed. Then I heard a quiet but unmistakable sound, the slow, deliberate unzipping of my tent door. I shot up, grabbed my headlamp, and switched it on. The beam of light illuminated the fabric, but the tent door wasn't open. I must have imagined the sound. Then something pressed against the tent wall. I didn't scream. I didn't move. I just sat there staring. The pressure disappeared. The silence stretched on. I don't know how long I sat there before exhaustion took over. I must have fallen asleep at some point because I woke up to daylight filtering through the fabric. I unzipped the tent carefully, stepping outside with my knife in hand. The ground around my tent was disturbed. Footprints, human footprints. Someone had been standing there. I packed up immediately. The hike back to my car felt endless. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced someone was following me. The feeling of being watched never left. When I finally reached my car, I locked the doors the second I got in and drove away without looking back. I never went camping alone again.